Hello again. If you've already watched the first two lessons, you're probably wondering, when are we going to get to start writing some code? And the answer is right now. In this video, we're going to talk about events and how to handle events that occur within your application by writing some code. We'll keep the code simple for now by just setting some properties at runtime for the controls on our forms. And over the course of the next 3 or 4 videos, we're going to tack on some more of the C# language for you to include within your applications. So let's get started by talking about events. Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition creates event-driven programs. Now, what is an event-driven program? All that means is that your applications will respond to events. An event could be something as simple as program started, or it could be user clicked button, or user typed a certain key on the keyboard, or any number of interactions between your program and anything that's outside of the program. Now, your users are just one source of events that occur. Windows itself can send messages to your applications like shut down or data coming in from the internet, so you need to process it. And other programs can trigger events in your applications as well. As I'll demonstrate in just a moment, there are literally hundreds of possible events that your application can react to. Now, I'm oversimplifying events just a little bit here, but I think you can use this as a working definition throughout this lesson series. Once you move on, you start advancing your skills, you're going to begin to realize that there's some neat things that you can do with events, but I'm going to leave that for another time. Let's take a quick look at the Hello World application from Lesson 1, and let's talk about that line of code that we wrote to display a message in a little message box on screen. Now, if you recall what happened in that lesson, I double-clicked the button, and the code view appeared. And at the time when we double-clicked that button, Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition created a template of code for us. And I want to take a few moments to talk about that template of code that it actually created. It named it automatically as private sub button1 underscore click. And there's also some other words that probably don't make a whole lot of sense that come after that. Let's not worry about that for right now. Just understand that this first line defines the beginning of an event handler, and whenever this event is triggered, the code that we type in between that private sub button1 click and at the very bottom that end sub, whatever we type in between those two lines of code will actually be executed whenever button 1 is clicked by our end user. In this case, we just have one line of code, but it could have easily been 10 lines of code or 100 lines of code, whatever we needed to put in there. Now, what is the significance of the private sub and the end sub words on those lines of code? Well, they define a block of code, or rather a code block, that either works together to accomplish a task. In this case, the task is to handle the button 1 click event, or they work together in order to organize the code. Now, if you look at the very top and the bottom, you see this public class form1 and end class at the very bottom. And they're just another organizational container for right now, an organizational unit that we're going to talk about much later in this series of lessons, I believe in lesson 6, and when we talk about classes. But for right now, just accept the fact that they're another organizational unit that groups code together. So the code view actually does something kind of neat with these two code blocks that we have here. It allows us to expand and contract these code blocks so that we can move this code out of the way or see how it rolls up. And whenever we roll it up, notice if we hover our mouse cursor over it, this little boxed area, it'll show us a synopsis of the code that's in there. Now, this is just a visual way to help us see distinctively the code blocks and how they are associated. And this will come in handy as we have a lot more code to view within this code area. But just to keep things simple and to recap for now, events happen within your applications, and you write your applications to respond to those events. And events come from a number of different sources. Some of them can be from the user of the application. Some of them can be from other applications such as Windows itself or another app that's running in the current session Windows. And the way you respond to those events is to write code within a code block called an event handler. You can see it here, private sub button 1 click, and all the way down to the end sub line of code. And That's just one way to define a block of code is through the use of this sub and sub nomenclature. Each block of code has its own name. You can see here it's button1_click. Uh, and before we move on, though, I want to introduce a new term. We've called this block of code an event handler, but an event handler is just a type of a more general structure called a method. And we'll be writing and calling, or rather triggering, our own methods in Lesson 6. And 95% of the code that we write will appear within the context of a method. So it's an important building block, and I wanted you to start hearing that term method. So this event handler private sub button1_click is actually known as a method. Let's continue our conversation about event handlers. Like I said earlier, there are hundreds of events that we can write code to handle. The question is, how do you know what other events are available to you? Do you have to memorize hundreds of commands? Well, absolutely not. In Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition, there are actually several different ways to determine which events a particular object, like a control, like a button control, can respond to, and then go on to create an event handler for it. Now, the first and most obvious way was what we did in the first lesson, which was to just double-click on the object in the design view, which creates the default event handler for that particular object. So in the case of the button, the default event handler is a click event. Each control's default event handler will depend on what makes sense for that particular control. But most of the time, the default event handler is at least one of the events that you'll probably want to handle within your application. But what if you need to handle an event that's not the default event? Well, the easiest way to see all the available events for our button control in this case is to select it within our design view, and then to select this little lightning bolt that appears here in our properties window, and we'll see a listing of all of the events that can be handled by our application that will be triggered by interaction with our button. Notice that I'm still looking at my button 1, but in this case I'm looking at all of the events that can occur for that button. So we have the most obvious one, the click event, but we can also handle things like, for example, let's just drag through here. What if we were to enable drag and drop within our applications? Then there's some events that can allow us to work with that. Or the ability for us to detect whenever the current selection is the button. So the user has used the tab button several times, and before they click the button, maybe we want to do a check on the entry that they've made within the form and notify them that perhaps they missed a required field without having to pop open a message box and being very obtrusive. Well, we could use these focus events to do that. You can see they're kind of grouped together just like the properties are grouped together whenever we're looking at that view. Then also, for example, if somebody were to try to resize or move this button, we can respond to those events and so on. There's just literally dozens of different events that can be responded to for this given button. Now, most of the time, we're only going to want to work with the click or perhaps one or two other events, but in some cases, on some controls, we may want to enable a number of these events so that we can enable some really rich functionality within our applications. If we want to create, for example, an event handler for whenever the focus has come on our button, then all we need to do is just like double click that particular line within the properties, and notice that we're brought back to our code view for private sub button 1 enter, and now we can write our code just like we did in the example in lesson 1. Now going back to our form view, if we want to look at our properties again, we just need to select right next to the lightning bolt back, we go back to the properties view. So that's how you get back between viewing the properties for a given object, in this case a button, or the events for that same object. You can toggle between these two views of properties and events for that item. Now the third way to create event handlers is that you can type them in yourself. Now this is not easy to do at all. In fact, in C#, it's much easier to do than in Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition, but it's something that you could do if you had the inclination. We're not going to demonstrate how to do that in this series of videos. The reason is because Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition just does it for you mistake-free, and it allows you to really work through this process of working with events and with objects on your forms very quickly. Speeds up the process of writing applications, so we're not going to worry about anything that would slow us down. So now that we understand more about events, we want to move on to some fun stuff. Let's write some code in those event handlers that do something a little bit more meaningful than just pop up a message that says, "Hello world." In the previous lesson, we looked at how to adjust the properties of an object, like a control or a form, using the Properties window, and we talked about how this is just a shortcut for writing the code ourselves. Now we're going to look at writing code in our event handler methods in order to change a property of an object on our form. So I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to call it Lesson 03. So I'm going to go to File, New Project. I'm going to make sure the Windows application template is selected. I'm going to change the name to Lesson 03 and click the OK button. You might get a message that says, "Are you sure you want to discard the changes that you're currently working on?" Just for the time being, if you get that message, select discard. So we have now a new project called Lesson 03 with our form, and I want to drag and drop a text box control onto our design surface and a button. So what I'm going to do is whenever the user selects the button, I'm going to change the text property of my text box to be Hello World. So I'm going to have to refer to these controls in my code, and the way that I do that is by using their name. Now, as we noted in the previous video, every control has a name. We can change the name. The name is different from the text property. So we could change this to BTN OK or OK button, and we can change this from text box 1, its current default name, to something like result text box or TXT result, something along those lines. We're just going to leave the default names the way that they are right now. I'm going to double click button 1 so I can get to the code view. It'll automatically create the button 1 click event handler template for me. And within this, I'm going to type the following code. First of all, I want to reference the text property of my text box 1. So text box 1, the name of my text box, dot, and this is how I'm going to access or reference one of the properties of my text box object, is by using this little period or dot nomenclature. And you'll notice that it automatically has a default property of text. That's exactly the one we want to use. So I'm just going to type it in, or I can use the space bar to automatically type that whole word text for me, equals, and then I'm going to use 2 parentheses and type in hello world. We'll talk about the use of parentheses whenever we talk about variables and string literals. We're not going to talk about that right now. But what I've done after hitting the enter key on my keyboard is that I have now set the value of text box 1, specifically the value of the text property of the text box 1 control, equal to hello world whenever button 1 click is activated, whenever the user clicks button 1. So let's go ahead and run our application. And you can see here that by default our text box has nothing in it. I'm going to click our button control, and notice now that the property, the text property of text box 1 has been modified to be hello world, and we've done this using code. We can change just about any property in the same manner by referencing the name of the object, using the dot notation, and then typing in the property name. I'm going to take a quick moment to point out some of the ways that Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition helps you whenever you're writing code. Did you notice that whenever we were typing in our code here, and we did something like this, we hit the period, notice that this little box popped open. This is called IntelliSense, and what it does is it really does 2 things for us. It gives us a visual reminder of all of the properties and methods that are available for this given object. So in this case, notice that when I hit the dot, it went directly to text. Now, why did it default to the text property? Well, most of the time, whenever you're trying to work with the text box control, you're going to want to modify the text property or retrieve information from the text property of the text box control. Also, I can use my up and down arrows to navigate through this list, and when I do that, notice off to the right hand side I get a little bit of a pop-up window that explains the usage for this particular property. In this case, notice the second line gets or sets how the text is aligned within a text box control. The text property is gets or sets the current text in the text box, and so on. So the other thing that it will help us do is whenever we're trying to find a given property, for example, I want to change the height, I can use the H and then look through all of the H properties and maybe E for height, and I find the height, I find the property I'm looking for. I don't have to type out that entire word. All I need to do is use the next logical character in order to move on. So I might use, like, for example, the space bar. And notice when I use the space bar on my keyboard, it typed in the rest of the word height. Or I might use the equal sign because I'm going to set the text property or the height equal to 50 or something along those lines. And when I do that, notice that it types out the rest. So it reduces the amount of typing that I need to do. So IntelliSense has a lot of practical uses, and the more you practice working with IntelliSense, it'll reduce the amount of typing that you have to do. So for example, I'm just going to type in T and then hit the space bar equal to, hello world. We'll just duplicate this line of code. It'll reduce the amount of typing that you have to do by maybe like 10 or 20%, but it'll also increase the accuracy so that you don't have to remember these long property names or method names, and it will just make your typing more accurate. Of course, this assumes that you can touch type and you can keep your eyes on the screen while you're typing with your hands. So that just takes a little bit of practice, and pretty soon, even if you're not a touch typer today, probably within a few weeks you'll get a lot better. Your typing skills will improve greatly. Admittedly, we haven't written a lot of code just yet, but I want to get you started with a few good habits. And one of the best habits to get into is to comment your code. A comment is just a description of what a section of code is attempting to accomplish. You make comments in order to remind yourself of your thought process or the reason that this section of code exists, and you do this in clear language so you can understand it or other people can understand it. Comments don't get compiled into your program, and they don't make your program any larger. So we highly recommend that you use as many comments as make sense. Now there's two ways to create comments. The first way to make a comment is to go to a line of code and then use the single quotation mark and then start writing code. This is a code comment. The other way to comment your code, in this case, I want to what's called comment out a line of code that I don't want within my application anymore. So when I comment out a line of code, it won't execute this line of code, but it still makes it available in case I made a mistake and got rid of a line of code that I actually needed later on. And to do that, I can use this comment out selected lines button on my toolbar. And when I do that, notice that it puts a little single quote there. And if I select it again and I want to reuse this line of code, all I need to do is select this uncomment the selected lines, and it gets rid of that single tick. Now, why do you need a button for that? Well, if you had 30, 40 lines of code that you wanted to briefly comment out just to see if that would impact your application, you can select all those lines of code and comment them all out at one time, or uncomment out those lines of code. So there's really two purposes at work here. The one purpose is to make comments in your code to remind you what a section of code is attempting to do in clear language. And then the other use of a comment is to remove those lines of code that are no longer useful to you, but you don't want to delete just in case you might need them in the future. Now, when you get started, it's easy to forget about comments, especially those comments that have to do with explaining in clear language what a section of code is attempting to do. And even for some of us who've been doing this for a long time, we may forget to take the time to write clear comments. but it's much easier to read through well-written comments to understand what your code is doing rather than to interpret what the code is attempting to accomplish. And I'll have more to say about writing meaningful codes at the end of this series of videos when we're building our RSS Reader application. Because as you move into a more professional programmer role, you're going to find that it's an invaluable tool to help not only yourself but also those who will work with you on a project to understand what a section of code or a passage of code is attempting to accomplish. Okay, we're just about finished with this lesson, but while we're here in the code view, I thought we'd take a quick aside and look at a few more features so that you have a good comfort level, since this is where you're going to wind up spending the majority of your time whenever you're creating software. A little while ago, we looked at how the code view allows us to roll up and expand our code blocks, our methods, and our classes by using those little plus minus buttons off to the left-hand side. But you can create your own little roll-ups that help you to organize your code. And sometimes I do this to group together different methods that might have a common purpose or a common goal. You can create what's called a region in order to roll up several methods together. So in this case, I'm going to create a region by using the pound sign and the keyword region and then giving it a name. This is a region. Okay, notice whenever I hit the Enter key on my keyboard that it automatically created the matching end region as well. And here, so I'm just going to do to write this is a code region. In this case, it contains nothing in particular, but we'll use regions in our project to better organize our code. Okay. Now in Visual Basic 2005, you cannot place a region inside of a method or an event handler, as we've been calling them, but you can place methods or event handlers within regions. You can also place things like variable declarations, comments, and things of that nature within regions as well. And again, this is just a way for us to create a section of code that can be rolled up. And notice whenever I hover my mouse cursor over a rolled up region that I can get a synopsis of it by hovering my mouse cursor over it. Okay. One thing that I recommend you do is that you always turn on the line numbering within any of the Express Edition tools. So in order to turn on line numbering, you go to Tools, Options, navigate to Text Editor Basic and select Editor. From here, select the Line Numbers checkbox under the Interaction section and then click OK. And notice now off to the left-hand side that each line of code has a corresponding number. It's in like an aqua color off to the left-hand side. So now I can say, take a look at line number 7 and you'll know the exact line of code that I'm referring to. This is also helpful whenever you're trying to take notes and remind yourself where you left off in your code or whatever the case might be. Another good tip is that say you find a great answer to a coding question online and it's in an MSDN article, for example. You can insert a hyperlink in your comments so you can revisit that article several months later when you have to make a change to your code. So let's do that right now. Let's just first of all type in this is a hyperlink in comments and then type in any hyperlink that you wish, and notice now that it has a line underneath of it. It detects automatically that this could be a hyperlink. And so in order to follow that hyperlink and bring open a browser window, I'm going to hold down the Control key on my keyboard, I'm going to hover my mouse cursor over that link and then click it, and notice that it brings that up in another window, a browser window within my Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition IDE. So this is very good to remind yourself or to find those articles or things online that can be very helpful and then refer to them in code for future reference. So these are just a couple of the useful tricks that you can learn to help you code more quickly, to find and understand what you've coded, and to organize your code. For now, just be aware of them, and we'll build on these in future lessons. And if you enjoyed this video, please visit www.learnvisualstudio.net to download and watch over 400 videos just like this one, aimed at all skill levels on many different topics related to C#, Visual Basic, ASP.NET, and more. Thank you.